Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight we're going to tell the story of an ending. Not the sudden, dramatic kind of ending. Not a battle lost in a single afternoon. Not a city falling in a single night. Not the kind of ending that produces a clean date to put in a textbook. The ending we're talking about tonight was the long, slow, grinding kind. The kind that takes decades to fully declare itself. The kind where the people living through it could not quite agree on whether it was happening at all, because each individual setback could be explained away, and each new expedition could be framed as the beginning of a recovery. The ending we are talking about is the end of the Crusades, the end of 200 years of Christian Europe's attempt to hold the Holy Land, to maintain a presence in Jerusalem and along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, to keep alive in stone and mortar and garrison and prayer the extraordinary achievement of the First Crusade, which had taken Jerusalem in 1099 and announced to a stunned world that it was possible for a Western army to march across 3,000 miles of difficult terrain and storm the most sacred city in 3 religions and hold it. They held it for 88 years the first time, until Saladin took it back in 1187. They never held it again. What they held after 1187 were the coastal cities Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, Antioch, a string of port towns and fortified positions along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and the question that the crusading movement spent the following century arguing about and funding expeditions to address, and failing to decisively answer, was how to use those coastal footholds to recover what had been lost. The Ninth Crusade, led by the future Edward I of England between 1271 and 1272, was the last serious Western military expedition to the Holy Land. And the fall of Acre in 1291, 19 years after Edward had gone home without solving anything, was the end of the last significant Crusader presence in the Levant. Between those two dates, and in the longer story that runs from the First Crusade in 1095 to the ships leaving Acre in 1291, lies one of the most complex, most consequential, and most misunderstood stories in the history of the medieval world. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the room go quiet. Find a comfortable position and let the breath slow. There's a lot of ground to cover, geographically and historically, and we are going to take it slowly and carefully and give it the weight it deserves. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the beginning of the story that would end with the last ship leaving Acre. The First Crusade of 1095 to 1099 was one of the most improbable military achievements in the history of the medieval world, and understanding why it happened and why it succeeded is essential to understanding everything that came after it, including the long unravelling that the Ninth Crusade represents. Pope Urban II preached the Crusade at the Council of Clermont in November 1095, calling on the warriors of Christian Europe to march to the aid of the Byzantine Empire, which had been pressing Rome for military assistance after the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 had opened Anatolia to Seljuk Turkish settlement, and to liberate the city of Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim rule since 638, and which had been under the specifically less accommodating rule of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt since 1098, the year before the Crusaders arrived. Urban's preaching at Clermont, and in the roadshow of sermons and rallies that followed it across France and the Rhineland, tapped into a remarkable confluence of religious emotion, martial culture, economic opportunity, and the specific medieval theology of pilgrimage and penitential warfare that made the crusade idea both spiritually compelling and practically attractive to a very large number of people across the social spectrum. What arrived at Constantinople in the spring and summer of 1096, much to the alarm of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, who had asked for a manageable force of Western mercenaries and received instead a vast, semi-organized horde of crusading armies, was a military force of between 60 and 100,000 people, including perhaps 30 to 40,000 fighting men, whose specific combination of heavy cavalry, siege expertise, and fanatical motivation would prove adequate against all reasonable expectation to the task it had set itself. The campaign from Constantinople to Jerusalem, conducted across 3 years of extraordinary hardship, drought, famine, disease, the ferocious resistance of the various Turkish and Arab powers in its path, produced a series of victories that the Crusaders and their contemporaries interpreted as direct evidence of divine assistance, because the alternative interpretation, that a collection of Western knights with no experience of the Middle Eastern climate, no familiarity with the geography, no established supply system, and no unified command had managed through military skill alone to take Antioch and Jerusalem against opponents who had every material advantage, seemed even less plausible. Jerusalem fell on July 15, 1099, after a siege of 5 weeks. The fall was followed by a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, whose scale and ferocity have been debated by historians, but whose reality is not in doubt. The chroniclers of the Crusade themselves describe the killing with a satisfaction that tells you something about the moral framework within which the campaign was understood. The kingdom of Jerusalem that the Crusaders established in the aftermath of the conquest was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable political constructions of the medieval period. A Western European feudal state transplanted to the Levantine coast, governing a mixed population of Western settlers, Eastern Christians of various rites, Muslims and Jews, maintaining itself through a combination of Western military culture and accommodation to the realities of the Levantine world that gradually, across the following decades, transformed the Crusader settlers into something that was not quite European anymore, and not quite native either, but a genuinely Levantine culture with its own specific character. The Latin states that emerged from the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, were not merely military outposts but functioning states with distinctive social, economic and cultural lives that deserve more than passing mention, because the world that was lost in 1291 was not simply a military garrison, but a civilization of genuine complexity. The Crusader society that developed over the 12th and 13th centuries was one of the more remarkable cultural phenomena of the medieval world. The Western knights and nobles who had conquered the Holy Land and settled there brought with them the feudal institutions, the legal traditions, the architectural practices and the cultural assumptions of northern France, the region from which the majority of the First Crusade's leadership had come, and transplanted them into the Levantine environment with varying degrees of adaptation. The kingdom's legal system, preserved in the assizes of Jerusalem, was one of the most sophisticated feudal legal codes of the medieval period, elaborated through generations of baronial custom and case law into a body of jurisprudence that later legal historians have studied with considerable interest. The constitutional arrangements of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in which the High Court of the realm's barons had genuine authority to check royal power, were in some respects more developed than those of contemporary European kingdoms. The settlers, who had lived in the Latin East for several generations, the people the Arabic sources called the Poulains, the foals, distinguished from the freshly arrived Crusaders from Europe, were not simply transplanted Frenchmen. They had adapted to the climate, to the food, to the specific rhythms of Levantine life in ways that the freshly arrived Europeans consistently found alarming. They dressed in lighter clothing more appropriate to the Mediterranean climate. They ate the local food, including the fruits and spices that the Levant provided in abundance and that Northern European cuisine did not. They maintained business relationships with their Muslim neighbours that the new arrivals sometimes condemned as inappropriate fraternizing with the enemy. They had learned Arabic to varying degrees, and the most thoroughly acculturated among them maintained bilingual households, where Arabic and French were spoken alongside each other. They had doctors and scholars who learned from the medical and philosophical traditions of the Islamic world that surrounded them, and the specific combination of Western and Eastern knowledge that this produced was one of the intellectual distinctive features of the Crusader states. The indigenous Christian communities, the Syriac, Greek, Armenian, Coptic, and Maronite Christians who'd been living in the Holy Land and Syria since before Islam, and whose relationship to the Western Catholic Crusaders was complicated by theological difference, linguistic distance, and the specific history of Byzantine Latin hostility that the Fourth Crusade would dramatically worsen, were present throughout the Crusader period as both subjects and neighbours, inhabiting the spaces between the Latin military and ecclesiastical establishment with a pragmatic accommodation to whatever political arrangements the moment required. They were, in some respects, the most genuinely continuous presence in the region, having survived the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the subsequent centuries of Islamic rule, and the Crusader presence in the 12th and 13th centuries, and their experience of the Latin occupation was shaped by the specific ways in which the Latin Church and the Latin military establishment treated communities of Eastern Christians whose practices and beliefs differed from Rome's. The Crusader cities, Acre above all, but also Tyre, Tripoli, Jaffa, Caesarea, and the others along the coast, were commercial centres of the first importance in the Eastern Mediterranean economy, and their commercial life was dominated by the Italian merchant communities, Venetian, Genoese and Pisan, whose trading networks connected the Levant to the markets of Western Europe. The Italian communes in the Crusader ports had their own legal jurisdictions, their own neighbourhoods, their own churches, their own internal political structures, and their own commercial interests that were sometimes aligned with and sometimes contrary to the military interests of the Crusader states. The silver and gold that moved through the ports of the Latin East in the 12th and 13th centuries, the proceeds of the spice trade, the silk trade, the trade in dyestuffs and glassware, and the other luxury goods that the Islamic world produced and the European world consumed, was the economic foundation of both the Crusader political establishment and the Italian commercial networks that would outlast it. The Latin states that emerged from the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, were not the only permanent result of the Crusade. The military orders that developed in the decades after the First Crusade were perhaps equally consequential for the story that would follow. The Knights Hospitaller, founded in the 1070s as a hospital organisation and militarised in the 12th century, and the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 specifically as a military order to protect pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem, were the institutional backbone of the Crusader military establishment throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. They were monastic orders whose members combined the religious obligations of monkhood with the professional military obligations of knights, and their combination of military expertise, institutional continuity. Unlike the secular nobility, the orders did not fragment on inheritance, and independent financial resources made them the most reliable fighting forces available to the Crusader states, and also, eventually, one of the primary sources of tension within those states. The world into which the Crusader states were born was not static, and the powers that surrounded them were not willing to accommodate their permanent existence. The great unifier who ended the first phase of Crusader success was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, who captured the county of Edessa in 1144, the first major Crusader territory to be lost to Muslim reconquest, and the event that triggered the Second Crusade of 1147 to 1149. The Second Crusade, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and the French King Louis VII, was a disaster. Poorly organized, strategically confused, ultimately directed at Damascus, which was actually one of the Crusaders' most important potential allies against the more dangerous powers to the north, and defeated outside Damascus in 1148 in a campaign whose failure was so complete and so embarrassing that contemporaries who had been confident of divine support had to work hard to explain why it had not been provided. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, consolidated his father's achievements and built a political coalition in Syria that surrounded the Crusader states on three sides. And then, in 1169, a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din ibn Ayyub, Saladin, arrived in Egypt as the Fatimid vizier's military commander, overthrew the Fatimid Caliphate into 1171, reunited Egypt and Syria under his own control by 1174, and began the systematic campaign that would culminate in the capture of Jerusalem in 1187. Saladin is one of the most remarkable figures in the medieval world, a man whose military ability was matched by a political intelligence that consistently preferred to incorporate defeated enemies rather than simply destroy them, and whose personal code of conduct toward non-combatants was sufficiently different from the norm of the period that it attracted admiration even from his Christian enemies. The legends that grew around him in both the Islamic world and the Christian world within his own lifetime tell you something about the impression he made on contemporaries as a different kind of political figure from the ones they were accustomed to. The Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, was the decisive military catastrophe of the first period of Crusader history. Saladin, who had been systematically probing and testing the Crusader kingdom's defences for years, manoeuvred the Crusader army, led by the controversial King Guy of Lusignan, whose decision-making was poor and whose political position within the kingdom was disputed, into the arid plateau west of the Sea of Galilee, cut off from water, surrounded and destroyed in detail over 2 days of fighting in July heat that the armoured Western knights were not equipped to endure. The true cross, which the Crusaders carried into battle as their most sacred relic, was captured. The bulk of the Crusader military establishment was killed or taken prisoner. Jerusalem fell to Saladin 3 months later, on October 2nd, 1187, in a negotiated surrender that Saladin conducted with a deliberate magnanimity that stood in pointed contrast to the First Crusade's massacre of 1099. He ransomed those captives who could pay, released those who could not on favourable terms, and guaranteed the safety of the Christian population in ways that his contemporaries found remarkable and that his chroniclers recorded with genuine admiration. The Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192 was the Western response to Hattin and Jerusalem, and it deserves more detailed treatment than its summary allows, because it was the campaign that established the specific coastal basis on which all subsequent Crusader presence would rest, and because the relationship between Richard and Saladin that it produced was one of the most remarkable examples of chivalric mutual respect between enemies in the history of medieval warfare. The Crusade assembled 3 of the most powerful rulers in the Western world: Philip II of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, and Richard I of England. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land, one of the more absurd deaths in the history of crusading. The most powerful ruler in Germany drowned in a stream while on his way to fight in Palestine, and the German contingent largely disintegrated after his death. Philip II and Richard cooperated uneasily through the siege of Acre. The city had been under siege by a Crusader force since 1189, an extraordinary 2-year siege conducted by an army that was itself besieged by Saladin's surrounding forces, one of the more complex military situations of the medieval period, and took the city in July 1191. Philip then returned to France, citing illness and the urgent need to attend to affairs at home, leaving Richard to continue the campaign that their combined resources had begun. Richard's campaign down the coast from Acre toward Ascalon was one of the most disciplined military operations of the medieval period, and one of the best documented. The march was conducted under constant attack from Saladin's harassing forces, cavalry raids from the flanks and the rear, arrow storms from the hills above the coastal road. The specific pressure of a force trying to provoke a disordered response that it could then exploit. Richard's response was to maintain formation with a rigidity that the crusading armies of the 12th century had rarely achieved. The infantry on the landward side of the column, shields presented to the arrows, the cavalry protected in the centre, the march maintained at a pace that the infantry could sustain, the formation not broken by the provocation of the harassment. At the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, when the Hospitaller rearguard finally broke discipline and charged, Richard managed to convert what could have been a disordering rout into a controlled counterattack that inflicted significant losses on Saladin's pursuing force. Ascalon was taken and fortified. Richard twice approached Jerusalem, once in December 1191 and once in the summer of 1192, and twice withdrew when the military situation made clear that taking the city was achievable, but holding it, with the forces available and the political situation in the Crusader states, was not. The calculation was genuine. An army that took Jerusalem and then could not hold it would have achieved nothing strategic and would have lost the coastal positions that were the base of future operations. Richard's enemies in his own time, and some historians since, have accused him of lacking the courage or the commitment to push on to Jerusalem. But the decision to withdraw, made twice, both times against the preferences of the rank and file of the crusading army, was probably the most strategically correct decision of the Third Crusade, even if it was also the most politically painful. The Treaty of September 1192 gave Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, secured the coastal cities for the Crusaders, and left the fundamental question: who would hold Jerusalem politically, unresolved? It was the best outcome that the military situation allowed, and the most honest recognition of what the Third Crusade could and could not accomplish. Richard left for England, was captured by the Duke of Austria on his way home and held for ransom, and returned to England in 1194 to spend the final 5 years of his reign fighting Philip of France in Normandy, before dying of a crossbow wound while besieging an insignificant castle in 1199. He never returned to the Holy Land. The Third Crusade of 1189 to 1192 was the Western response to Hattin and Jerusalem, and it produced the most dramatic confrontation of the crusading period. Richard I of England and Saladin in a series of military encounters along the Palestinian coast and into the interior that neither side managed to resolve decisively. Richard's reconquest of the coast, the long march from Acre to Ascalon, conducted in one of the most disciplined military operations of the medieval period, established the coastal basis for what remained of the Crusader presence, but his twice aborted approach to Jerusalem, abandoned both times when the strategic situation made clear that taking the city would be easier than holding it, left the Third Crusade's central objective unaccomplished. the treaty that ended the Third Crusade allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem but left the city in Saladin's hands. The Christian world was going to need another attempt. What followed the Third Crusade was not one more attempt but several. The fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth Crusades spanning the period from 1202 to 1272. And each of them tells a different chapter of the story of why the crusading project ultimately failed. The Fourth Crusade of 1202 to 1204 is perhaps the most notorious. The crusading army, diverted by a combination of Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine dynastic politics, ended up sacking Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was a fellow Christian state, in 1204, establishing a short-lived Latin empire in the city, and dealing a blow to Byzantine power from which it never fully recovered. It is one of the most extraordinary examples in history of a military expedition achieving precisely the opposite of its stated purpose and its consequences. The permanent damage to the relationship between the Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, the weakening of Byzantium that would eventually contribute to its vulnerability to Ottoman conquest, were felt for centuries. The Fifth Crusade of 1217 to 1221 targeted Egypt directly, correctly identifying the centre of Muslim power in the region as the key strategic objective rather than Jerusalem itself. The campaign achieved significant initial successes. The capture of Damietta in 1219 was a genuine military achievement, before the strategic decision to advance on Cairo ended in catastrophic defeat, with the crusading army trapped by the Nile floods in 1221 and forced to surrender Damietta in exchange for safe passage home. The decision to reject an Egyptian offer that would have traded Jerusalem for Damietta, an offer rejected by the papal legate Pelagius over the objections of the military commanders, was one of the more consequential missed opportunities of the entire crusading period. The Sixth Crusade of 1228 to 1229 achieved what the Fifth had failed to do, and it did so through diplomacy rather than warfare, which made its achievement theologically uncomfortable for most of the Christian world. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who was simultaneously under papal excommunication, in a long-running dispute with Pope Gregory IX over the obligations of his crusade vow, negotiated a treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt that returned Jerusalem to Christian control for 10 years, along with Bethlehem and Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast, in exchange for a cessation of Christian military pressure on Egypt and a mutual defence agreement. The treaty was deeply unpopular with the military orders and the resident Crusader nobility, who found the terms inadequate, the process dishonest, and the theological status of a peace made by an excommunicated emperor with a Muslim sultan deeply problematic. Jerusalem was recovered. Almost no one was pleased by how it happened, and the recovery proved short-lived. Jerusalem was lost again in 1244, this time permanently from the Crusader perspective, when the Khwarezmian warriors who the Ayyubids had recruited as auxiliary forces sacked the city and overwhelmed the combined Crusader and Egyptian forces at the Battle of La Fourby. The Seventh Crusade of 1248 to 1254, led by King Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, who would become the defining image of the ideal Crusader king and one of the most canonized figures of the medieval church, repeated the Fifth Crusade's strategic logic with essentially the same results. Louis's army captured Damietta again, advanced toward Cairo, was defeated in the flooding Nile Valley again at the Battle of Al-Mansura in 1250, and was captured, Louis himself taken prisoner along with most of his army, ransomed at enormous cost and allowed to proceed to the remaining Crusader territories in the Levant, where he spent 4 years reorganizing their defences before returning to France. The Battle of al-Mansura is significant not only for its immediate outcome but for the specific military circumstances that produced it. The Crusader forces were defeated partly by a military unit of the Mamluk Sultanate, whose tactics and ferocity would define the next phase of the conflict. The Mamluks, enslaved soldiers of Kipchak Turkic origin who had been imported into Egypt as elite military units, and who were in the process of becoming the dominant military and political power in Egypt, had arrived. The Mamluks who defeated Louis IX's crusade in 1250 did not remain subordinate to the Ayyubid sultans for long. In 1250, in the immediate aftermath of al-Mansura, the Mamluk commanders assassinated the last effective Ayyubid sultan, establishing a Mamluk sultanate in Egypt that would rule until 1517. The first great Mamluk sultan was Baybars al-Bundukdari, Baybars the crossbowman, named for his early military specialty, and he is the dominant figure of the period that leads directly to the Ninth Crusade and the fall of Acre. Understanding Baybars is essential to understanding why the Crusader presence in the Levant could not be sustained, because he was not merely a capable military commander, but a strategic intelligence of the First Order who understood the problem he was solving with a clarity that none of his predecessors had matched. Baybars had been born into a Kipchak Turkic family on the steppes north of the Black Sea, enslaved as a young man and sold through the slave markets of the medieval Islamic world, eventually purchased into the Mamluk regiment that would become the dominant military force in Egypt. He was present at the Battle of al-Mansura in 1250, where his tactical innovation contributed to the defeat of Louis IX's advance guard. He participated in the assassination of the last Ayyubid Sultan. He fought the Mongol invasion of Syria at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the battle where the Mamluk army defeated a Mongol force for the first time in the history of Mongol expansion, a victory whose strategic significance was enormous because it established that the Mongol advance into the Islamic world and toward Egypt and North Africa could be stopped. And in 1260, Baybars himself organized the assassination of the reigning Mamluk Sultan and assumed the Sultanate, beginning a reign that would last until 1277 and that would fundamentally change the strategic position of the remaining Crusader states. The Mongol factor in the story of the Ninth Crusade deserves its own careful attention, because the Mongol invasions of the 1240s through 1260s transformed the political landscape of the entire Middle East in ways that both threatened and tangled the Crusader presence. The Mongols under Hulagu Khan had swept across Persia and Mesopotamia in the 1250s, sacking Baghdad in 1258 and killing the Abbasid Caliph, ending the Abbasid Caliphate that had been the nominal spiritual authority of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries. They had then advanced into Syria, sacking Aleppo and Damascus and pushing toward Egypt. It was this Mongol advance that Baybars had turned back at Ain Jalut in 1260, establishing himself as the defender of the Islamic world against the Mongol threat, and giving his sultanate a legitimacy and a prestige that the mere act of political murder could not have provided. The Crusader states had responded to the Mongol advance with a policy whose opportunism is understandable and whose strategic consequences were disastrous. Some of the Crusader leadership, seeing in the Mongols a potential ally against the Muslim powers that surrounded them, had allowed Mongol forces to pass through their territories and had provided some logistical support. The Prince of Antioch had been given favourable terms by the Mongol commander in exchange for his cooperation. This Crusader-Mongol relationship was never a formal military alliance. Attempts to create one, pursued across several decades of diplomacy between the Crusader states and various Mongol Khans, never produced a coordinated military campaign, but it was real enough to be known to Baybars and to give him a political justification, alongside the straightforward military calculation for the aggressive campaign against the Crusader states that he launched from 1265 onward. Before we can fully appreciate Baybar's campaign against the Crusader states, we need to understand the Mamluk system that produced him, because that system, the specific social and military institution of enslaved soldiers trained from childhood to be the finest heavy cavalry in the world, was itself one of the most unusual and most effective military innovations in the history of the medieval Islamic world, and without understanding it, the Mamluk achievement against the Crusaders cannot be properly explained. The word Mamluk means owned or possessed in Arabic, and the institution was precisely what the word suggests: a system of military slavery in which young men, typically Kipchak Turks from the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caucasus, were purchased as children or adolescents, converted to Islam, trained intensively in the military arts from an early age, and organized into elite cavalry units that served the rulers of Egypt and other Islamic states. The institution was not new in the Islamic world. It had been present in various forms since the 9th century. But the specific form it took in Ayyubid Egypt in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the degree to which it concentrated military power in a specific corps of soldiers, created the conditions in which the Mamluks could translate their military superiority into political power. The training that Mamluk soldiers received from childhood was unlike anything available in the Western military tradition of the same period. It was systematic, specialized, and cumulative, beginning with horsemanship and archery in early childhood, progressing through the Furusiyya, the formal military arts curriculum that covered lance technique, sword technique, the management of horses at speed, the coordination of cavalry formations, and the strategic and tactical thinking that effective command required. A Mamluk cavalry soldier who had completed the full training program was a military instrument of extraordinary effectiveness, capable of a rate and accuracy of fire from horseback that contemporaries found astonishing, capable of the kind of disciplined formation riding that the Crusader heavy cavalry required sheer physical courage, but not the same level of integrated technical skill, and motivated by the specific combination of Islamic religious conviction and intense unit loyalty that the Mamluk barracks culture had produced. The Battle of Ain Jalut on September 3rd, 1260, where the Mamluk army commanded by the general Qutuz and his subordinate Baybars defeated a Mongol force in the valley of Ain Jalut near Nazareth in Palestine, was one of the most consequential military engagements of the 13th century, and its significance for the story of the Crusades was both immediate and long-term. The Mongol advance under Hulagu Khan had reached Syria and seemed, to contemporaries on all sides, unstoppable. The Mongols had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, had sacked Aleppo and Damascus, and appeared poised to continue through Palestine and into Egypt. The Crusader states, watching the approach of a power that some of their leaders hoped might be an ally, and that others feared as a new existential threat, had adopted the ambiguous position of nominal neutrality that allowed the Mongol forces to march through Crusader territory on their way south. The victory at Ain Jalut was achieved through a combination of tactical intelligence and the exploitation of terrain and the specific weakness of the Mongol force, which was smaller than the forces that had devastated Mesopotamia and Syria, because Hulagu had withdrawn much of his army to deal with succession disputes in the Mongol heartland. But it was also a genuine demonstration of Mamluk military excellence. Baybars, who commanded the Mamluk vanguard, used a feigned retreat to draw the Mongol cavalry into terrain where the main Mamluk force could envelop them, a tactical maneuver that required exceptional control of troops under pressure, and that worked precisely because the Mamluk cavalry was disciplined enough to carry out a coordinated withdrawal and re-engagement without losing its formation. The Mongol force was destroyed, It was the first significant defeat that a Mongol army had suffered in the field since the consolidation of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, and its psychological impact, the demonstration that the Mongols could be beaten, was at least as important as its immediate military result. Baybars' campaign against the Crusader states was methodical, relentless, and strategically sophisticated in ways that none of the previous Muslim campaigns against the Crusaders had been. He had studied the Crusader defensive system carefully, and he understood its specific vulnerabilities. The great castles that were the backbone of Crusader territorial control were extremely strong individually, but were separated from each other by distances that made mutual reinforcement difficult. The Latin states were chronically undersupplied with military manpower, dependent on the military orders and on the periodic arrival of crusading reinforcements from Europe that could never be predicted or counted upon, and the political divisions within the Crusader states, the factional conflicts between the Templars and the Hospitallers, between the various Italian merchant communities, between the resident nobility and the visiting Crusaders, had been a source of strategic weakness throughout the 12th and 13th centuries and remained so. Baybars attacked not to take isolated positions and then wait for the Crusaders to respond, but to take multiple positions simultaneously, maintaining military pressure across the entire front, giving the Crusaders no opportunity to concentrate their limited resources at any single point. In 1265 he took Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266 he took Seft, one of the most important Templar fortresses in Galilee, after a siege in which the garrison was induced to surrender on terms and then killed when they emerged from the walls, an act of deliberate treachery that served the strategic purpose of demonstrating that no terms offered by Baybars during a siege were to be trusted, which made subsequent garrisons fight to the last rather than negotiate. In 1268, he took Jaffa and then Antioch. The fall of Antioch, which had been a Crusader possession since 1098, was one of the most catastrophic losses of the period, eliminating the northernmost of the major Crusader states and killing or enslaving a large fraction of its population. The Count of Tripoli, who was also Prince of Antioch through inheritance, was at Tripoli when the city fell and was spared the experience of watching his principality destroyed. But Baybars sent him a letter describing the fall with a clinical precision that seems designed to cause maximum psychological damage. When you learn what has befallen your people, you will wish you had been there to share their fate, Baybars reportedly wrote. And the letter has been cited by subsequent historians as a document that reveals something specific about Baybars' understanding of psychological warfare as an instrument of strategic policy. It was in this context, Baybars' systematic dismantling of the Crusader defensive system, the fall of Antioch, the exhaustion of the remaining Crusader positions, that the Ninth Crusade was conceived and launched. But to understand the Ninth Crusade, you also need to understand the Eighth, because they were connected at the organisational level even if they diverged dramatically in their execution. King Louis IX of France, the same Louis who had led the disastrous Seventh Crusade and spent 4 years reorganising the Levantine defences before going home in 1254, is one of those historical figures whose personal qualities were so exceptional and so widely attested that the historical record becomes, in his case, a rare instance of hagiography and factual biography pointing in the same direction. He was canonised in 1297, within 26 years of his death, and the speed of his canonisation reflects the specific impression he had made on contemporaries, not just on those who had reason to flatter him, but on the practical men of affairs who worked alongside him and who described his personal conduct with the specificity of people reporting what they had actually witnessed, rather than what convention required them to say. Joinville's Life of St. Louis, the memoir written by Jean de Joinville, Louis's seneschal and companion on the Seventh Crusade, composed decades after the events it describes and remarkable for its combination of detail, affection, and occasional critical candour, is one of the most vivid personal portraits in medieval literature. Joinville describes Louis holding court under an oak tree in the woods of Vincennes, dispensing justice personally to petitioners who came before him, listening to cases on a blanket spread on the ground in the manner of a patriarch of the Old Testament, who was also a king of France. He describes Louis's personal frugality, the refusal to wear fine cloth or expensive shoes, the daily charitable works, the personal care for the poor and the sick, that went beyond the ceremonial charity that the period required of powerful men. He also describes Louis's specific religious practices, the hours of prayer, the midnight rising for matins, the hair shirt, and the disciplines of personal mortification that the devotional culture of the 13th century endorsed, with a detail that suggests he was describing the man he actually lived alongside, rather than the saint that the canonization process was constructing. Louis's decision to target Tunisia on his Second Crusade has generated historical debate about whether he was deceived by Charles of Anjou's self-interested advice, or whether he had genuine strategic reasons for the choice. The argument that Tunisia could be a base for a renewed Egyptian campaign had some logic in the abstract, and the idea that the Hafsid ruler might convert to Christianity, an idea apparently encouraged by reports of his favourability toward Christian visitors, was the kind of optimistic intelligence assessment that the wishful thinking of crusade planning regularly produced. What is clear is that Louis believed the decision was strategically sound, that he prepared the expedition with his characteristic thoroughness, and that he died of disease before the campaign could demonstrate whether his assessment was correct. His death outside Tunis, on a campaign bed surrounded by his advisers and his confessor, reciting the word Jerusalem as his last word, or so the hagiography records, was the kind of death that subsequent ages have found it easy to make meaningful, regardless of whether the meaning it bore was the one Louis himself would have chosen. King Louis IX of France, the same Louis who had led the disastrous Seventh Crusade and spent 4 years reorganizing the Levantine defences before going home in 1254, spent the following decade in France conducting the administrative and judicial reforms that would make him a figure of great admiration in French history and eventually secure his canonization in 1297. But the crusading impulse that had dominated his personal religious life since his early 20s had never left him, and as the news of Baybars' campaign against the Crusader states reached France through the 1260s, Louis began planning what he intended as the definitive crusade, the campaign that would finally resolve the situation in the Holy Land permanently. He took the cross again in 1267, and spent several years organising the most carefully prepared crusading expedition since the Third Crusade. What Louis chose as his objective was not the Holy Land directly, but Tunis, on the North African coast. The strategic reasoning behind this choice has been debated ever since. At the time, it seemed to many of his contemporaries that the choice was inexplicable, and the involvement of his brother Charles of Anjou, the King of Sicily, who had commercial and political interests in North Africa that a Tunisian campaign might serve, has led some historians to suggest that the target was chosen partly for Charles's benefit rather than purely for the strategic benefit of the Holy Land. The argument that Louis was making, that Tunisia could serve as a base for a renewed approach to Egypt, or that the Hafsid ruler of Tunis might be induced to convert to Christianity and become an ally, was not entirely without logic, but it was the kind of logic that required a great deal of things to go right, and that left no margin for the things that could go wrong. Louis's army landed in Tunisia in the summer of 1270. Within weeks, disease broke out in the crusading camp with the speed and thoroughness that the North African summer and the inadequate sanitation of a military encampment produced in people with no immunity to the local disease environment. Louis IX died on August 25th, 1270, probably of typhus or dysentery, outside the walls of Tunis without having fought a battle or accomplished anything strategically meaningful. He was 55 years old and had spent more of his adult life thinking about the Crusade than about anything else, and he died in the camp of a campaign that was almost immediately understood by contemporaries as a failure, though the specific piety and the specific holiness with which Louis had conducted his life gave even this final futile expedition a different quality in the Christian memory than the simple military disaster its outcome represented. Charles of Anjou negotiated a treaty with the Hafsid ruler that secured his own commercial interest in Tunisia and allowed the surviving crusading forces to leave with their honour technically intact. The crusade of which Louis had been the emotional centre dissolved into evacuation and departure. And then, in the harbour of Tunis, the remaining crusading fleet made contact with the force that had been sailing to join Louis's expedition, and that arrived to find it already over. The small but serious crusade organised by Prince Edward of England, the eldest son of Henry III, who was bringing perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers to the Holy Land, and who, on learning that Louis was dead and the Eighth Crusade was finished, made the decision to proceed east anyway. Edward of England, who had become Edward I in 1272 when his father Henry III died, comes to the crusade from a domestic English context that shaped his understanding of both kingship and military organisation in ways that the crusade would further develop, and understanding that context illuminates why Edward brought to the Holy Land a seriousness and a professionalism that distinguished his expedition from some of its predecessors. Henry III's reign, the 56-year reign that made it the longest of any medieval English king, had been defined by the struggle between the Crown and the barons over the constitutional settlement of Magna Carta, a struggle that reached its crisis in the 1260s when Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, led a baronial reform movement that captured the king and effectively governed England in his name. Simon de Montfort is one of the more complicated figures in English medieval history, a French-born nobleman who became the champion of English constitutional reform, who convened in 1265 the Parliament that was in some respects the ancestor of the modern House of Commons, and who was killed at the Battle of Evesham in August 1265 by Edward's forces in one of the most decisive engagements of medieval English history. Edward's victory at Evesham was not only a military triumph, but a political one that re-established royal authority and allowed him to negotiate the terms of the post-war settlement with a political skill that the subsequent stability of Henry III's final years reflected. The England that Edward left for Crusade in 1270 was more stable than it had been for decades. The baronial wars were over, the constitutional settlement had been renegotiated, and the political nation had achieved a degree of equilibrium that his departure did not threaten. Edward's administrative ability, already visible in his management of the post-Evesham settlement, had given him a sense of how to organise complex operations that the Crusade would require. He was also, by 1270, a man of considerable military experience. Evesham had been a sophisticated tactical operation, using terrain and timing to envelop and destroy a larger force, that demonstrated exactly the kind of operational intelligence that the crusading theatre would reward. His decision to proceed to the Holy Land after Louis IX's death at Tunis, when the practical and diplomatic arguments for simply returning home were entirely reasonable, tells you something essential about Edward's character and his priorities. He had made a vow to go on crusade, and for a man of his specific understanding of Christian knighthood, breaking a vow without completing it was not merely dishonourable, but spiritually dangerous. He also had, alongside the religious conviction, a genuine strategic curiosity about what could be accomplished in the Holy Land with the resources he had available, and the characteristic confidence, which his later career would repeatedly demonstrate, that his own military ability could accomplish more in a difficult situation than more cautious men might assume. Edward of England, who had become Edward I in 1272 when his father Henry III died, but who was simply the Lord Edward when he departed on crusade in 1270, is one of the more compelling figures of the late medieval period, and his crusade is worth examining both for what it tells us about the state of the crusading movement in 1271, and for what it tells us about Edward himself, who would go on to be one of the most consequential kings in English history, the Hammer of the Scots, the conqueror of Wales, the reorganiser of English law and administration, and also, in his crusading enterprise, one of the last Western rulers to take seriously the idea that the Holy Land could be recovered and held. Edward had taken the cross in 1268, alongside his father the king and his brother Edmund, as part of the wave of crusading enthusiasm that Louis IX's preparations had generated across Western Europe. He was 29 years old, physically imposing. He was exceptionally tall for the period, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, and had the commanding presence that contemporaries consistently remarked on, and already an experienced military commander, having fought in the baronial wars that had consumed England through the 1260s, including the Battle of Evesham in 1265, where he had defeated Simon de Montfort's rebel baronial coalition in a tactical display that demonstrated both his military ability and his capacity for the kind of deliberate cruelty that the medieval battlefield regularly required. He was also, which mattered enormously for a crusader, genuinely motivated by religious conviction, not the complicated theology-wrestling faith of Frederick II, not the resigned pragmatism of the later Crusader nobility, but something closer to the uncomplicated martial piety that Urban II had originally invoked at Clermont. The sense that the Holy Land was a place that Christian warriors had an obligation to defend, and that defending it was both a spiritual duty and an expression of the highest form of Christian knighthood. He arrived in Acre in May 1271 with his contingent of English knights and soldiers and the additional forces he had recruited in Sicily, and immediately set about the business of understanding what could practically be done with the resources available. What he found in Acre was not encouraging. The city was the largest and most important of the remaining Crusader positions, a wealthy trading port whose Italian merchant communities had made it one of the richest cities in the eastern Mediterranean. But it was also a city whose political life was dominated by exactly the factional conflicts that had been weakening the Crusader states since the 12th century. The Venetians and the Genoese had been at war with each other in the streets of Acre in the 1260s, in a conflict called the War of St. Sabas that had damaged the city's defences at exactly the moment when Baybars was beginning his campaign against the Crusader states. The Templars and the Hospitallers were at odds. The various noble families of the remaining Kingdom of Jerusalem, depleted by loss and divided by succession disputes, were not the unified political force that a coherent defence required. Edward could not rebuild the Crusader political system in the time available, and he understood this. What he could do was conduct military operations that demonstrated the continued capability of Western arms, attempt to build the Mongol alliance that had been talked about for decades without materializing, and pressure Baybars enough to buy time for a more substantial relief effort to be organized. He pursued all three of these objectives with the energy and the military professionalism that characterized everything he did. The military operations Edward conducted during his 14 months in the Holy Land were not large-scale campaigns, but the kind of aggressive raiding and limited offensive action that the resources available to him could support. He led a raid from Acre toward Nazareth in June 1271, reaching within sight of the city before withdrawing when it became clear that the forces he had were insufficient for the deeper inland operations that taking and holding territory would require. He participated in the relief of the Hospitaller fortress of Crac de Chevalier, the great castle in Syria, whose extraordinary military architecture has made it one of the most visited and most studied fortifications in the world, which was under threat from Baybars' forces. He led a night raid on the town of Cocoon in the Sharon Plain, destroying supplies and demonstrating that the Crusaders could still project force outside their walls, even if they could not hold territory. The Mongol dimension of Edward's strategy was the most ambitious and the least successful element of his crusade. He sent multiple embassies to the Mongol Ilkhanate of Persia, the successor state to Hulagu Khan's conquests, proposing the coordinated campaign that Western Crusader leadership had been seeking for 2 decades. The Ilkhanate Beyka responded positively and sent a Mongol force into Syria in October 1271, a force that raided as far as Aleppo and demonstrated the potential of Mongol pressure on Baybars' northern flank. But the Mongol raid was not a sustained campaign, and did not achieve the strategic effect that more committed intervention might have produced. The Mongols withdrew before the winter, Baybars consolidated his position, and the window of potential Mongol Crusader coordination closed without having produced a decisive result. The moment that defined Edward's crusade in the historical memory, and in the legend that the event generated almost immediately, was not a military engagement, but an assassination attempt. In June 1272, an emissary from the Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect that had been using political murder as a strategic instrument for 2 centuries, and whose agents had penetrated several royal courts and military orders, arrived at Acre apparently as a messenger from a Niemir who had been in negotiation with Edward. The emissary gained access to Edward's private quarters and attacked him with a poisoned dagger. Edward was wounded in the arm before he could overpower the attacker and kill him. The wound became infected, and there followed several weeks during which Edward's life was in genuine danger from the poison or from the infection that the wound generated. The sources differ on which was the primary threat, before he recovered. The legend that immediately attached itself to this episode was that Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, saved his life by sucking the poison from the wound with her own mouth, risking her own life to draw out the venom. The story appears in several near-contemporary sources and has become one of the most celebrated episodes in the romantic mythology of the medieval nobility. Modern historians are divided on whether it happened as described. Sucking poison from a wound is not actually effective as a treatment, which either suggests the story is embellished or that Eleanor's motivation was symbolic and emotional rather than medical. What is not disputed is that Eleanor was with Edward throughout the Crusade, had accompanied him from England, and was present in Acre during the assassination attempt, which puts her in the right place for some version of the story to be accurate, even if the specific detail of poison extraction is legendary. Edward's devotion to Eleanor was genuine and lifelong. When she died in 1290, he had memorial crosses erected at every stopping point on the route her funeral cortege took from Lincoln to London. The Eleanor crosses whose originals have mostly been destroyed but whose memory has been preserved in the names of places like Charing Cross in London. And the story of her saving his life in Acre was the kind of story that their marriage made people want to believe. Whether or not the assassin attack was ordered by Baybars, the most common attribution in both medieval and modern sources, is not established with certainty by the evidence. Baybars had used assassin agents before, and Edward was enough of a threat to make his removal strategically desirable. But the assassin leadership also had independent interests and independent clients, and the attribution to Baybars may reflect the tendency to assign to the most powerful actor whatever dramatic events occur in his neighbourhood. What the assassination attempt tells us with certainty is that Edward was considered dangerous enough by someone in the region to be worth killing, which is a kind of backhanded testament to the impression his crusade had made. By the summer of 1272, it was clear that Edward's crusade had reached the limit of what it could accomplish with the resources available. He had demonstrated that Western military forces could still operate effectively in the Holy Land. He had maintained the Mongol diplomatic relationship. He had conducted raids that demonstrated Crusader offensive capability. He had not recovered any significant territory. He had not reversed the strategic trajectory that Baybars was imposing on the remaining Crusader positions. And he had received news from England that his father Henry III was dying, which created an urgency about his return that the Crusade's limited strategic situation could not override. He negotiated a 10-year truce with Baybars, a truce that gave the remaining Crusader positions a breathing space without resolving the underlying strategic problem, and in September 1272 he embarked from Acre for the last time. He would never return to the Holy Land. No significant Western crusading force would follow him. The 10-year truce that Edward had negotiated bought the Crusader states time that they used in various ways, none of them adequate to the fundamental challenge of survival against an enemy whose strategic position was improving while theirs deteriorated. Baybars died in 1277, reportedly from drinking a cup of poisoned kumis that he had prepared for someone else, a death whose irony his contemporaries noted with the relish that such endings invite. He was succeeded by Qalawun, another Mamluk commander of the first rank, who continued his predecessor's strategic campaign against the Crusader states with the same methodical patience and military sophistication. The years between Edward's departure in 1272 and the fall of Acre in 1291 were not a period of stasis, but of slow, continuous erosion. The Crusader states were losing population. The Western settlers who had built the Latin East over 2 centuries were leaving, not always in response to specific disasters, but simply because the rational calculation for a family with choices was that the Latin East was not a place to build a future. The merchant communities of Acre maintained their commercial presence because the trade was too profitable to abandon, but the agricultural hinterland that had supported the Crusader population in the 12th century was largely under Muslim control, and the defensive perimeter was shrinking. The military orders continued to garrison the remaining positions and to conduct the kind of active defence that their professional commitment required. But their resources were stretched across too many positions, and their political divisions continued to sap the coherence that effective defence required. Qalawun picked off the remaining Crusader positions with the same strategic patience that Baybars had displayed. The fortress of Markab, the great hospitaller castle on the Syrian coast, fell in 1285 after a long siege. Latakia fell in the same year. The city of Tripoli, capital of the county of Tripoli, the last of the original 4 Crusader states to remain partially intact, fell in 1289 after Qalawun's army destroyed the siege engines that had made the defence technically viable and then overwhelmed the walls. The survivors who escaped to the small island of St. Thomas offshore watched the city being demolished. Qalawun ordered it razed to prevent future use as a Crusader base, from a distance that was close enough to see but too far to change. Acre was all that remained, and in the spring of 1291, Qalawun's son Al-Ashraf Khalil, who had inherited the sultanate on his father's death in 1290, brought an army that contemporary sources estimated at 60 to 100,000 men, figures that are almost certainly exaggerated but that indicate a force of very significant size, against the walls of the city that was the last real Crusader stronghold on the mainland of the Holy Land. The Siege of Acre in 1291 was one of the decisive events in the history of the medieval world, and before we describe its specific course, it is worth understanding the city itself at the moment of its greatest crisis, because Acre in 1291 was not just a fortress, but a living city of extraordinary density and complexity, whose civilian population was as much a part of the siege as the garrison. Acre at its peak was probably home to 30 to 40,000 permanent residents, with the number swollen by refugees from the surrounding areas who'd been flooding into the city as the Mamluk campaign reduced the other positions around it. It was organised, like most medieval port cities, around a combination of its commercial waterfront, the great harbour where the ships of Venice, Genoa and Pisa docked alongside the smaller vessels of local merchants and fisherfolk, and its internal neighbourhoods, which in Acre's case were extremely distinct and extremely competitive. The Venetian quarter had its own streets, its own warehouses, its own church and administrative buildings, separated from the Genoese quarter and the Pisan quarter by boundaries that were not merely geographical, but political and occasionally violent. The various national and religious communities, French, English, German, Italian of various cities, Eastern Christian of various rites, each had their own institutional presence. The military orders each controlled significant urban territory. The Templars had their great compound at the southwestern corner of the city, overlooking the sea. The Hospitallers had their hospital complex and their fortified headquarters in a different quarter. The Teutonic Knights had their own compound. This patchwork of jurisdictions and loyalties, which had been a source of chronic political dysfunction throughout the Crusader period, became in the final weeks of April and May 1291 the specific texture within which the defence had to be organised. The Mamluk siege began on April 5th, 1291, when Al-Ashraf Khalil's army arrived before the walls and began the process of establishing the siege camp, deploying the siege train, and beginning the systematic bombardment that the Mamluk siege engineers had perfected across decades of operations against the remaining Crusader positions. The specific mangonels and trebuchets that the sources mention, including the great engine called the Victorious, were aimed at the towers and walls of the outer defensive circuit with a precision that reflected the prior reconnaissance the Mamluk intelligence had conducted and the engineering expertise of the men operating the machines. The defenders launched counter-bombardment from their own engines on the walls, conducted sorties to disrupt the siege works, and maintained a daily rhythm of defensive activity that was both physically exhausting and strategically futile. The Mamluk army was too large, too well supplied, and too professionally organised to be significantly disrupted by garrison sorties, however courageously conducted. The Templar Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, who commanded what passed for the unified defence of the city, was a man who had been warning for years about the inadequacy of the defensive preparations and the impossibility of holding Acre against a determined assault without substantial Western reinforcement that was not coming. His reputation among contemporaries was complicated. Some praised his military judgment, others criticised his diplomatic contacts with the Mamluk court as inappropriate fraternisation with the enemy. But in the final siege his leadership was generally effective and his personal courage was not in question. He died on the walls on May 18th, 1291, struck by a crossbow bolt or a spear thrust. The sources differ in their specifics, during the Mamluk breakthrough assault, carried from the walls by his household knights and dying shortly thereafter. His death, at the moment of the wall's final breach, was one of those historical coincidences that seem to contemporaries like the closing of an era, the last effective commander of the last Crusader city falling on the day the city fell. The siege of Acre in 1291 was one of the decisive events in the history of the medieval world, and the specific drama of its 6 weeks from April to May 1291 has been reconstructed by historians with considerable care from the multiple contemporary accounts, Christian and Muslim, that documented it. The city that the Mamluk army surrounded was not militarily insignificant. Acre had strong walls, a substantial defensive circuit, the resources of a wealthy trading city, and a garrison that included the full military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, the third military order that had been established in the late 12th century, along with the military contingents of various Frankish nobles and the levies that the Italian merchant communities could provide. The total defending force has been estimated at perhaps 15 to 20,000, of whom perhaps 1,000 were trained knights and men-at-arms of the military orders. The Mamluk siege train that Khalil brought against Acre was the product of decades of investment in the specific technology of taking fortified cities. The Mamluks had learned from the Crusaders and had learned from the Mongols and had developed their own siege engineering capability to a level that made even the strongest positions of the period vulnerable to sustained attack. The mangonels and trebuchets that they brought against Acre's walls were numerous and heavy. Sources mention a specific engine called the Victorious, a trebuchet of exceptional size and power, alongside many others, and the systematic bombardment they maintained against specific sections of the wall was the product of careful prior reconnaissance of which sections were most vulnerable and what angle of attack would produce the greatest effect. The defenders fought with the desperation of people who understood that there was no relief coming. The military orders conducted sorties from the walls, trying to disrupt the siege works and destroy the siege engines before they could be brought to bear against the walls. The Hospitallers attempted a night raid on the Mamluk camp that was initially successful in penetrating the outer lines, before it encountered the main camp defences and was forced to withdraw with significant losses. The Templars mounted their own counter-attacks. The population of the city, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside and the other fallen positions, watched from within the walls as the siege engines did their work and the walls began to show the damage that sustained bombardment produced. The final assault came on May 18th, 1291. The Mamluk army attacked simultaneously at multiple points along the walls, with a specific concentration of force at the sections that the siege train had most thoroughly damaged. The King of Jerusalem, Henry II of Cyprus, who had arrived with a small relief force in the final weeks of the siege, more a gesture of solidarity than a strategic reinforcement, was present in the city for the final assault. The fighting was intense, and the defenders held the walls for hours against the initial assault. But the weight of numbers and the condition of the walls made the outcome essentially determined. When the accused tower, one of the key defensive positions at the angle of the walls, fell, the organised defence collapsed into a fighting retreat toward the sea. What followed was one of the most dramatic and most terrible episodes in the history of the Crusades. The civilian population of Acre, the merchants and craftsmen and servants and pilgrims who'd been living in what had been the richest city of the Latin East, flooded toward the harbour as the Mamluk army entered the city. Ships of every kind were commandeered, overloaded with desperate people trying to reach the safety of the sea. Some capsized under their weight of human cargo. Others managed to clear the harbour and reach Cyprus or other destinations. The master of the temple, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded on the walls during the defence and carried to the harbour where he died. The Templar headquarters, a fortified complex near the sea, held out for several more days under the command of Peter de Sèvres, the Marshal of the Temple sheltering refugees within its walls. When negotiations with Khalil produced a safe conduct agreement and the refugees emerged, they were seized and killed in violation of the terms, an act of deliberate treachery, whether ordered by Khalil or by subordinates acting without his authorization, that the Christian sources condemned, but that the military logic of a commander who wanted no organized Crusader remnant to serve as a future nucleus of resistance made explicable if not justifiable. The remaining Templars withdrew to the final defensive tower, undermined the foundations, and when Mamluk soldiers entered to take possession, brought the structure down on both the attackers and themselves. The fall of Acre on May 28, 1291, was immediately recognised by contemporaries on both sides as something more than the fall of a city. It was the end of the Latin East. Within weeks, the other remaining Crusader positions on the mainland, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Haifa, were evacuated or surrendered without resistance. The garrisons, understanding that resistance was futile and that the political will to maintain the positions had dissolved with Acre. The military orders withdrew to Cyprus. The surviving population scattered to Cyprus, to Armenia, to the Italian city-states from which many of the merchants had come. The Teutonic Knights moved their headquarters eventually to the Baltic, where they would spend the following century creating a different kind of Christian military state in Prussia. The Hospitallers went first to Cyprus and then to Rhodes, where they would remain until 1522, when the Ottoman Empire finally expelled them, and then to Malta, where they stayed until Napoleon took the island in 1798. The Knights Templar returned to France, and to the fate that would destroy them there 15 years later, when Philip IV of France, in debt to the order and unwilling to remain so, arrested them in 1307 and prosecuted the leadership for heresy. The specific story of the Templars' destruction is worth telling in some detail, because it was one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of medieval institutions, and because the accusations made against the order have generated a mythology that has never entirely been dispelled. Philip IV, Philip the Fair, as contemporaries called him, referring to his physical appearance rather than his conduct, was one of the most capable and most ruthless monarchs of the early 14th century, and his campaign against the Templars was a masterpiece of political manipulation that used the full machinery of the medieval state: the Inquisition, the papacy, the legal system, the propaganda apparatus, to destroy an institution that had been one of the pillars of the crusading enterprise for nearly 2 centuries. The Templars were enormously wealthy. Their banking operations, which had developed from the practical need to transfer funds across the Mediterranean without the physical transport of gold and silver, had made them one of the most important financial institutions in Western Europe, and their creditors included several European monarchs, Philip prominent among them. They were also, after the fall of Acre, an institution in search of a mission. The military function that had justified their existence was without a theatre, and the various proposals for a merged military order or a new crusade that would give them purpose had not materialized. The specific charges that Philip's agents formulated against the Templars, that the order required new members to deny Christ and spit on the cross in their initiation ceremony, that they engaged in obscene kisses and sodomy, that they worshipped an idol called Baphomet, were almost certainly fabrications, constructed from the confessions extracted under torture from Templar prisoners and from the specific form that late medieval heresy accusations tended to take. The Templars who confessed, and many did under the conditions that medieval judicial torture produced, retracted their confessions when brought before papal commissioners and were willing to die rather than maintain what they had said under duress. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Temple, confessed under torture, was allowed to live, and then in 1314, as he was being displayed publicly with the other condemned leaders as a confirmed heretic, retracted his confession before the assembled crowd and declared the order innocent of all charges. He was burned at the stake the same afternoon on the Ile des Javiots in the Seine, an island in Paris within sight of Notre Dame Cathedral, and reportedly cursed Philip IV and Pope Clement V from the flames, predicting that both would follow him within the year. Both did, within 8 months. The coincidence has fed a legend ever since. The Knights Templar returned to France, and to the fate that would destroy them there 15 years later, when Philip IV of France, in debt to the order and unwilling to remain so, arrested them in 1307 and prosecuted the leadership for heresy, dissolving the order and burning the last Grand Master Jacques de Molay at the stake in 1314. The immediate Christian response to the fall of Acre was grief and determination that found expression in elaborate plans for new crusades that were never mounted. But before we follow the political response, it is worth tracing what happened to the specific people who escaped the fall and whose experience of displacement and loss gives the abstract historical event its human texture. The ships that left Acres harbour on and after May 18th, 1291, carried a population of survivors whose destinations were determined by whatever vessel they had managed to board and whatever resources they had brought with them. The wealthy, the major Italian merchants, the leading noble families, the senior clergy, had the resources to direct their immediate destinations and to begin the process of rebuilding their commercial and social lives in Cyprus, in Italy, in France, or wherever their networks could support them. The Italian merchant communities that had dominated Acre's commercial life reconstituted themselves partially in Famagusta in Cyprus, which briefly flourished as a commercial entrepot after the fall of Acre, before the political complexities of Cypriot politics and the declining volume of Levantine trade reduced its importance. The survivors who arrived with little more than their lives found themselves in the position that refugees have always occupied in history, dependent on the charity and the political calculations of the communities that received them, carrying the specific skills and the specific cultural formation of the world they had left, needing to find ways to apply those skills and that formation in places that were similar enough to be navigable, but different enough to remind them constantly of what had been lost. Some settled permanently in Cyprus, which became a centre of Crusader cultural and political life in the decades after 1291. The kings of Jerusalem continued to use the title, and the court culture of Lusignan Cyprus maintained the forms and the memory of the Latin East with a fidelity that was partly genuine sentiment and partly political positioning for the return that everyone hoped was coming. Some returned to Italy or France, carrying the specific Levantine cultural influences that the Crusader period had generated, and that are visible in the art and architecture and intellectual life of the Italian city-states of the late 13th and 14th centuries. Some joined the military orders and continued to serve in whatever theatres those orders found themselves. The specific fate of the military orders after 1291 is one of the more interesting chapters in the aftermath of the fall of Acre. The Hospitallers, as we have noted, moved to Cyprus and then to Rhodes, where they established a remarkable island state that combined the military and naval functions of the order with the administrative requirements of governing a real territory with a real population. Their defence of Rhodes against the Ottoman sieges of 1480 and 1522, the first successfully, the second not, produced some of the most dramatic military episodes of the late medieval and early modern periods. The Teutonic Knights, whose original mission in the Holy Land had always been somewhat secondary to their operations in the Baltic, found in the conquest of Prussia a theatre where the crusading framework could be applied to a different set of enemies with results that the Palestinian theatre had not provided. Their Ordensstadt, the state they built in what is now northern Poland and the Baltic states, was one of the more unusual political formations of the late medieval period, a military order governing a territorial state in the name of Christianization and conquest. Pope Nicholas IV, who was pope when Acre fell, immediately called for a new crusade and commissioned strategic studies of how it might be conducted. The following decades produced a remarkable body of crusade planning literature, the treatises of Fidenzio of Padua, Ramon Lull's repeated proposals for a new kind of missionary and military approach to the problem, William of Tripoli's analyses of the Islamic world and how the crusade might more effectively engage with it, that demonstrate both the persistence of the crusade ideal in the Christian imagination and the increasingly academic quality of the discussion, the sense that the plans were being made by people who understood that the practical obstacles were enormous without quite being willing to acknowledge that they were insuperable. Philip IV of France, the same king who would destroy the Templars, took the cross in 1313 and began serious preparations for a new crusade, plans that his death in 1314 ended definitively. Edward II of England, the much less capable son of Edward I who had conducted the Ninth Crusade, briefly contemplated a new expedition before the domestic political crises of his reign consumed his attention. The Avignon papacy of the early 14th century continued to issue crusade encyclicals and collect crusade taxes from a Christian laity that was increasingly sceptical about where the money was actually going. None of it produced a military expedition to the Holy Land. What the fall of Acre did produce in the longer run was a gradual transformation of the crusade idea itself, a reorientation of the concept of holy war from the specific objective of the Holy Land to broader applications that could be conducted closer to home and with more reliable results. The Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian reconquest of the Muslim-held territories of Spain, had been framed in crusading terms since the 12th century, and it continued with renewed energy through the 13th and 14th centuries, culminating in the fall of Granada in 1492, the year of Columbus's voyage. The Northern Crusades, the military campaigns of the Teutonic Knights and other crusading orders against the pagan and Orthodox Christian peoples of the Baltic and Eastern Europe, represented another application of the crusading framework to a different theatre, one where the combination of military power and missionary purpose was more consistently productive than it had ever been in the Holy Land. The Crusades against heretics within Christian Europe, the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy in southern France in the 13th century, and the later campaigns against the Hussite movement in Bohemia in the 15th century, represented a further extension of the crusading idea that its originators had not anticipated, but that the logical structure of the idea made available. If a holy war against external enemies of Christianity was spiritually meritorious, why not a holy war against internal enemies? The extension was easy to make in theory and deeply problematic in practice, and the Albigensian Crusade in particular produced atrocities of sufficient scale and visibility to generate the kind of moral questioning of the entire Crusade project that Urban II's original vision had seemed to preclude. The historical assessment of the Crusades has changed dramatically across the centuries since their end, reflecting the specific preoccupations of the periods doing the assessing as much as the actual content of what was being assessed. The medieval Christian view was simply that the Crusades had been necessary, holy, and unfortunately unsuccessful. that the failure to permanently hold the Holy Land was a failure of Christian unity and human sinfulness, rather than a failure of the concept itself. The 18th century Enlightenment view, expressed most influentially by Voltaire and Gibbon, was that the Crusades had been a symptom of medieval religious fanaticism, a barbarous diversion of European energy and resources that had produced nothing but suffering and wasted lives, conducted in the service of superstition rather than reason. The 19th century Romantic view reversed the Enlightenment assessment, finding in the Crusades an expression of Christian chivalric culture at its most elevated, the Crusader as the ideal medieval knight, motivated by faith and honour, conducting himself according to the highest codes of his civilization. The 20th and 21st centuries have produced a more complex historiography that has tried to understand the Crusades in their own terms, rather than through the lens of later moral frameworks, while also taking seriously the perspectives of the Muslim, Jewish and Eastern Christian peoples whose experiences of the Crusades were substantially different from those of the Western Crusaders. The specific danger of the Crusade legacy in the modern world is its persistent availability as a rhetorical and ideological resource for parties who want to invoke it for purposes that have nothing to do with its medieval context. Both Western politicians who have used crusading language to describe modern conflicts in the Middle East and Islamic political movements that have used the historical memory of the Crusades to frame modern political grievances have done so in ways that require the flattening of the Crusades' actual historical complexity into a simple narrative of Western aggression against the Islamic world, a narrative that is not entirely wrong in its identification of what the Crusades were from the perspective of the people on the receiving end of the military campaigns, but that loses the specific historical texture without which the Crusades cannot be understood, and that serves modern political purposes by distorting historical reality. The Crusades were not a single unified campaign of Western aggression. They were a complex, extended, internally divided, frequently self-defeating enterprise that produced, over 2 centuries, a remarkable range of cultural exchange alongside the violence, and whose legacy is embedded in the history of the Mediterranean world, the legal and institutional history of the Western Church, the history of military architecture, and the development of international trade in ways that the simple narrative of aggression and resistance cannot accommodate. The specific things that the Crusades produced, the military orders, whose institutional innovation influenced the development of European military organization for centuries, the architectural tradition of the castle, whose development in the Crusader states introduced engineering concepts that were carried back to Europe and transformed Western defensive architecture, the translation movement that brought Greek and Arabic texts into Latin through the contact between Christian and Islamic intellectual cultures that the Crusades both facilitated and disrupted, the commercial networks that the Italian city-states developed in the Levantine ports, and that were the foundation of the later Mediterranean trading economy. All of these were real products of the crusading encounter, and they complicate the simple moral accounting that treating the Crusades purely as a story of religious violence encourages. The people who lived through the end of the Crusader presence, the knights and merchants and clergy who sailed away from Acre in May 1291, the survivors who made their way to Cyprus or Italy or France, understood what they had witnessed in terms that combined grief, guilt, and the specifically medieval theological challenge of explaining why God had allowed the Holy Land to be lost. The literature of lamentation that the fall of Acre produced, the laments and complaints and calls for new crusades that circulated in the years immediately after 1291, is one of the more moving bodies of medieval writing, precisely because it is so transparently the expression of people trying to process an event whose meaning they could not quite accept. The Holy Land was supposed to be recoverable. The Crusades were supposed to be winnable because they are holy wars, and holy wars properly conducted should have the support of the God in whose name they were fought. The failure of the Crusades required an explanation that the theology of the time could provide: human sinfulness, insufficient unity, inadequate penance. But the explanation always had to work against the accumulating evidence that the project had simply, in the end, failed. The Crusade ideal did not die with Acre. It persisted through the 14th and 15th centuries, generating crusading plans and crusading enthusiasm, and the occasional actual military expedition, most of them directed against the Ottoman Empire as it expanded into Byzantine territory and then into Europe, culminating in the catastrophic defeat at Nicopolis in 1396, where a combined crusading army was destroyed by the Ottoman forces of Bayezid I. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, which ended the Byzantine Empire that the Crusades had both helped and damaged, produced another wave of crusading rhetoric from the papacy and from the major European rulers, rhetoric that was not backed by a significant coordinated military response, because the European powers were too absorbed in their own conflicts to organize one. The specific concept of the Crusade, the papally authorized indulgence military campaign for specifically religious objectives, gradually lost its institutional coherence across the 15th and 16th centuries, replaced by the more nakedly political and commercial motivations of the early modern European expansion that sent Portuguese and Spanish ships around Africa and across the Atlantic under banners that still carried religious imagery, but whose driving purposes were increasingly secular. The last crusade, the ninth, Edward's, was the last serious Western military effort to do what the First Crusade had done, to take and hold the Holy Land by force of Western arms. What it demonstrated, in the specific combination of military competence and strategic inadequacy that Edward's campaign embodied, was that the tools available to the crusading enterprise were no longer adequate to the strategic situation they faced. The Mamluk sultanate under Baybars and Qalawun was a more formidable and more strategically sophisticated adversary than any the Crusaders had previously faced, more formidable than Saladin, because Saladin had been a single commanding figure whose death could change the situation, and the Mamluk system was institutional rather than personal, producing capable commanders as a matter of course rather than depending on individual genius. The Western political system that might have supported a more sustained crusading effort was distracted by its own internal conflicts, the papal-imperial struggle, the French-English rivalry, the Italian city-state competition, in ways that prevented the unified command that the situation required, and the fundamental demographic reality that had always defined the Crusader situation. Too many enemies, too few settlers, too thin a line of military defence stretched across too many miles of difficult terrain, had not changed and could not change as long as the Western political will to sustain a genuine colonial presence in the Holy Land remained insufficient to the task. Edward I of England, who sailed from Acre in September 1272 and became King of England before he reached home, spent the following 3 decades as one of the most capable and most energetic kings in English history. He reorganised English law, conquered Wales, fought inconclusive wars with Scotland that produced the specific political situation that William Wallace and Robert Bruce would subsequently navigate, and maintained throughout his long reign the ambition to return to the Holy Land that he had never been able to fulfil. He took the cross again in 1287 and again in 1300, each time beginning preparations for a crusade that other commitments then prevented. He died in 1307, on his way north to fight another Scottish campaign, and according to a tradition that his contemporaries found entirely plausible and that later historians have accepted as at least expressing something true about his priorities, He asked on his deathbed that his bones be carried at the head of any future crusading army. The Crusader king who could not go himself being carried into the field in death as he had always wanted to go in life. His bones were not so carried. The crusading army he imagined never assembled. What remains of the Crusades in the physical world is remarkable in its extent and its preservation, but the physical remains only fully make sense when you understand the institutional and devotional life that surrounded them, because the castles and the churches of the Crusader period were not merely military and religious infrastructure, but expressions of a specific way of understanding the relationship between faith, violence, and the sacred geography of the Holy Land. The pilgrimage tradition that preceded the Crusades, and that continued throughout them and after them, was the devotional foundation of the entire enterprise. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the Crusades happened at all. Jerusalem was not merely strategically important to the medieval Christian world, it was the most sacred place on earth, the site of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection, the location of the Holy Sepulchre and the other sites that the Gospels described and that medieval pilgrims had been visiting since the earliest centuries of Christianity. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem was one of the supreme acts of medieval piety, more dangerous, more expensive, and therefore more spiritually meritorious than the pilgrimage to Rome or Santiago de Compostela, and the hundreds of thousands of medieval Christians who made the journey did so at genuine risk to their lives and fortunes, in the conviction that the physical contact with the sacred places of the Holy Land was a spiritual act of the highest order. When the Seljuk Turks disrupted the pilgrimage routes in the late 11th century, not by prohibiting pilgrimage, which the Islamic tradition generally permitted, but by the political instability that their conquest of Anatolia and Palestine produced, which made the routes more dangerous. The anxiety this created in the Christian world was not merely political but existential. The ability to visit the sacred places was, in the medieval understanding, a form of access to the divine that political disruption was threatening, and Urban II's appeal at Clermont tapped into this anxiety as directly as it tapped into the martial culture of the knighthood he was addressing. The Knights Hospitaller, whose full name was the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, began not as a military order but as a hospital organisation, and the hospital they operated in Jerusalem before the Crusades was one of the largest and most sophisticated medical institutions in the medieval world. The hospital at Acre, which the Hospitallers operated at the height of the Crusader period, was by the standards of the 13th century extraordinary, capable of housing several hundred patients staffed by physicians who drew on both the Western medical tradition and the Arabic medical literature that was more advanced in specific areas, providing care for pilgrims and soldiers and civilians with an organised charity that distinguished the order's mission from the purely military function it had acquired over the 12th century. The combination of medical care and military prowess in the same institution was unusual in the medieval world, and was one of the reasons the Hospitallers survived the fall of Acre with more institutional resilience than the Templars, whose purely military function was harder to justify in a post-Crusade environment. The military architecture that the Crusaders developed in the Holy Land and Syria represented a genuine advance in the science of fortress construction that was carried back to Western Europe through the experience of returning Crusaders and their builders. The concentric castle, the design in which an outer defensive ring protects an inner ring, creating multiple defensive layers that an attacker must breach in succession, was developed in its most sophisticated form in the Crusader states, in response to the specific challenge of defending positions with small garrisons against large attacking forces. Crac des Chevaliers, the great Hospitaller fortress on the Syrian ridge, is the most complete surviving example of this tradition. Its concentric walls, its round towers designed to deflect artillery and deny the attackers the stable base that a square tower offered, its sophisticated water management and storage, its administrative and residential buildings organized within the inner circuit, represent the high point of medieval defensive military architecture and the product of generations of accumulated engineering knowledge applied to a specific and demanding strategic problem. Edward I, who visited Crac des Chevaliers during his crusade and was deeply impressed by what he saw, brought back to England both specific architectural ideas and the engineers who could implement them. The great castles that Edward built in Wales to consolidate his conquest of that country in the 1280s, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, are directly descended from the Crusader architectural tradition, applying the concentric design principle and the sophisticated military engineering that the Holy Land had developed to the specific problem of controlling a hostile Welsh population with a minimum of garrison soldiers. The Crusades' contribution to the development of English, French and German military architecture is one of the more concrete and traceable legacies of the entire enterprise. What remains of the Crusades in the physical world is remarkable in its extent and its preservation. The great castles that were the backbone of the Crusader defensive system, Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Kerak and Shobak in Jordan, Belvoir and Atlit and Caesarea in Israel, are among the finest examples of medieval military architecture anywhere in the world, and they have been studied by architectural historians with an intensity that reflects both their historical significance and the specific beauty that their combination of functional engineering and aesthetic ambition produced. Crac des Chevaliers in particular, the great hospitaller fortress on the Syrian ridge overlooking the valley that connects the Lebanese coast to the Syrian interior, has been called by T.E. Lawrence the finest castle in the world, and the specific quality of its concentric defensive plan, its water management, its residential and administrative buildings, and the view from its walls across the Syrian landscape give some sense of what the Crusader military achievement looked like at its most accomplished. The castle survived the Mamluk siege of 1271 intact. It was taken by negotiation, not by force, a unique achievement of Baybars' strategic patience, and stood largely undamaged until the Syrian civil war of the 21st century, which caused some damage to its structures that has since been partially repaired. The churches that the Crusaders built in the Holy Land, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, substantially rebuilt by the Crusaders in the 12th century in its current form, the Cathedral of St. John in Acre, whose remains are visible beneath the Turkish mosque that was built over it, the Crusader churches of Cyprus and Rhodes that survived because the military orders carried their architectural tradition with them when they retreated, are the devotional legacy of the crusading presence, the physical expression of the religious purpose that the military enterprise was supposed to serve. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remains today what it was in the Crusader period, the most sacred site in Christendom for the various Christian traditions that share its custody, with varying degrees of mutual tolerance, the place where the tomb of Christ was believed to be located, and where the medieval pilgrims, who were the nominal justification for the entire crusading enterprise, had been coming for centuries before the Crusaders arrived, and continued to come in the centuries after they left. The intellectual legacy of the crusading encounter between the Christian West and the Islamic world is harder to trace in specific monuments, but is no less real. The Arabic numerals that medieval Europe adopted from Islamic mathematics, through the contact that the crusading presence facilitated and that the intellectual activity of the translation movement in Spain and Sicily simultaneously pursued, are the numerals you use every day. The specific medical and philosophical texts, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle, the mathematical and astronomical works of Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali, that entered the Western intellectual tradition through the translation movement, were not carried directly by the Crusaders, but were part of the broader encounter between Christian and Islamic civilization that the Crusades both motivated and complicated. The specific culinary traditions, the textile technologies, the agricultural plants, cotton, sugarcane, citrus fruits, that moved from the Islamic world into European practice during and after the crusading period are material traces of an encounter that was violent and competitive, and also, in ways that neither side fully intended, productive of cultural exchange on a scale that the medieval world had not previously experienced. The memory of the Crusades in the Islamic world is one of the more complex questions in the history of how societies remember the past. For most of the period from the 13th to the 19th centuries, the Crusades were not a particularly prominent feature of Islamic historical memory. They were one episode among many in the long history of conflict and contact between Islamic civilization and the Christian West. And the fact that the Crusaders were ultimately expelled meant that they had not permanently altered the political landscape of the region in the way that the Ottoman expansion into Europe had done. It was the 19th century, and specifically the European colonial penetration of the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that revived the memory of the Crusades as a framework for understanding the relationship between the Islamic world and the West. A revival that French colonialism in North Africa and the Levant, and British colonialism in Egypt and Palestine, actively encouraged by framing their colonial presence in the language of Christian civilization's extension into the Orient, and that Islamic political movements used in the opposite direction, drawing on the Crusade memory to frame contemporary conflicts in terms of a long historical struggle between Islam and the West. The Crusades were not simply the first Western imperialism, though they had elements that the later colonial movements would recognize. They were not simply a religious war, though religious motivation was genuinely primary for many of the participants. They were not simply a catastrophe for the Islamic world, though the violence they imposed on specific cities and specific populations was real and devastating. They were what complex historical events always are, a phenomenon whose meaning depends on where you're standing and what questions you're asking, and whose specific historical texture resists the simple moral narratives that later periods have been inclined to impose on them. The last ship left Acre on May 28, 1291. The city burned behind it as the Mamluk army moved through the streets, and the smoke rose from the warehouses and the churches and the palaces of what had been the last great city of the Latin East. The knights and the merchants and the priests and the servants who crowded onto whatever vessels had made it to the harbour watched the smoke rising from the sea and understood, most of them, that they were watching something end that would not begin again. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, which had existed in various forms since 1099, was finished. The great enterprise that had occupied the imagination and the treasure and the military capacity of Western Christendom for nearly 2 centuries had reached its final material expression in the smoke over a burning port city on the eastern Mediterranean coast. But what it had been, the aspiration, the violence, the genuine faith, the cultural encounter, the military achievement and the military failure, the castles still standing on the Syrian ridge, and the churches still serving in Jerusalem, and the political ideas and the legal concepts and the trade networks that the encounter had generated, and that had outlasted the kingdoms that produced them, all of that continued. History has a way of carrying forward the consequences of events long after the events themselves have ended, and the Crusades were no exception. The world that they left behind was different from the world they had entered, and the specific ways in which it was different. The military orders and their institutional innovations, the trade networks and their commercial logic, the translation of Islamic philosophy and science into the Western tradition, the specific political experiences of the Crusader states that fed into the development of representative institutions and constitutional thinking were carried forward into the centuries that followed and into the world that eventually became ours. The Lord Edward, who sailed from Acre in September 1272 with a truce in his pocket and an unsolved problem at his back, was sailing away from a city that would continue to exist for another 19 years. 19 years during which life in Acre went on with the peculiar combination of commercial vitality and existential uncertainty that characterized the final phase of the Latin East. The people who lived in Acre in those final decades were not primarily warriors or clergy. They were merchants and craftsmen and sailors and servants and the complex infrastructure of a major trading city, the money changers and the notaries and the translators who bridged the linguistic and cultural worlds that intersected in the port, the physicians and the apothecaries whose services the cosmopolitan population required, the women who ran households, and the women who kept the taverns and brothels that every port city has always depended on for the entertainment of transient sailors and soldiers. They lived in the knowledge that the strategic situation around them was deteriorating. The successive fall of the other coastal towns was not invisible, and the people of Acre watched the refugees arriving from Tripoli in 1289 and understood what the news meant. But they also lived in the present tense reality of a prosperous port city whose daily life continued to generate the commerce and the human activity that urban existence requires, regardless of strategic context. The pilgrims who continued to arrive in Acre throughout the 13th century, even as the strategic situation deteriorated, the pilgrimage stream from Western Europe never entirely dried up, were the most direct link between the city and the religious purpose that had generated the entire crusading enterprise. They came from France and Italy and England and Germany and the various countries of Eastern Europe, traversing the Mediterranean by ship from the Italian ports, arriving in Acre's harbour with the physical and emotional investment of people who had crossed a sea and left their ordinary lives for the purpose of touching the sacred geography of their faith. Many of them were accommodated in the Hospitaller hospital complex, which served as a combined hospital, pilgrim hospice, and charitable institution, whose scale and efficiency were genuinely remarkable by the standards of the period. Some proceeded from Acre to Jerusalem. The travel arrangements varied by the specific political negotiations in place at any given moment, and returned with the specific experience of the holy places that was the pilgrimage's stated purpose. Others died en route, of disease or accident, and were buried in the cemeteries that the various religious communities maintained along the pilgrimage routes. The specific quality of experience that the holy places provided to medieval pilgrims is difficult for the modern secular imagination to fully inhabit, because it required a specific investment of faith that is foreign to many contemporary people. But the accounts that medieval pilgrims left of their experiences in Jerusalem, in Willibald's 8th century account, in the 12th century pilgrim narratives, in the later accounts of the 13th century, consistently describe the encounter with the sacred places in terms of physical sensation as well as spiritual meaning. The specific quality of the light in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the feel of the stone under the hands when touching the places that the Gospels described, the overwhelming emotional release that the completion of the journey produced in people who'd been thinking about nothing else for months or years. These experiences were real, whatever their ultimate metaphysical status, and they were the human foundation of the entire crusading enterprise, the justification for the violence and the expense and the political complexity, the thing that the military achievement was supposed to protect, and that its failure left unprotected. The Lord Edward, who sailed from Acre in September 1272 with a truce in his pocket and an unsolved problem at his back, returned to England to become one of its greatest kings. He never went back to the Holy Land. The crusade that he had wanted to lead, the real crusade, the one with sufficient resources and sufficient political unity to actually recover and hold what had been lost, never came together in his lifetime, and he died in 1307 still trying to organize it. His bones were not carried to Jerusalem, but he had been there, and he had fought there, and the specific quality of his presence in Acre in 1271, the professionalism, the genuine religious motivation, the military seriousness, was the last expression of something that had been at the centre of Western Christian culture for 2 centuries, and that would never quite be at the centre again. The night is settling in now, and the long story of the last crusade has reached its end. The end of a particular 200-year project, not the end of the world or even of the region, both of which continued and continue, but the end of a specific attempt to do a specific thing that had defined the religious and military imagination of the medieval West, and that, having ultimately failed, left behind it a complicated legacy that the world is still, in various ways, working through. The castles are still there on the Syrian ridge, holding the view across the valley that the Hospitaller knights once held with their bodies. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is still standing in Jerusalem, still receiving pilgrims, still the most theologically contested piece of real estate in the world. The harbour of Acre is still there, smaller now, the old city of the Latin East buried under the Ottoman and modern construction above it, but still there, still a working port, still connecting the city to the sea that was its lifeline and its escape route, and the last thing the departing Crusaders saw as the smoke rose behind them. The Lord Edward is in Westminster Abbey, in a plain tomb whose austerity seems to reflect something about the man who chose it. The bells of the military orders still ring in Malta and in the other places where the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights maintained their presence into the modern period. The routes that the Crusaders marched, through southern France and northern Italy and the Byzantine road system and across Anatolia to the Syrian coast, are still walkable, still crossing the same landscapes, still passing through some of the same towns, though the world through which they pass is almost entirely different from the world the Crusaders saw. Let all of that settle around you now. The great enterprise is over. The castles are quiet on the ridge. The harbour at Acre is still tonight. The smoke is long since gone. And the 200 years that the Crusades represent, all the faith and all the violence and all the complexity and all the consequence, have settled into the permanent shape of what actually happened, which is the only shape that history ever takes in the end. Rest easy.